They invited her only to twist her words, interrupting each time she made a strong point. Her calm smile never faltered for a moment as she delivered the response that millions would share. The studio lights burned hot and bright, casting harsh shadows across the daily dialogue's sleek set. The show's signature blue and silver backdrop gleamed under carefully positioned spotlights, making everything appear more polished, more perfect than it actually was. Michael Bennett adjusted his tie, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, then glanced at the monitors showing the audience filing in, his expression calculating, assessing. 15 years as America's most respected liberal talk show host had taught him how to read a room, how to gauge exactly what would play with the crowd that filled his studio each afternoon, hungry for confirmation that their worldview was the right one. His producer Alicia approached, tablet in hand, expression serious. "We're all set," she said quietly. Research team found some contradictions in her previous statements. Plenty of material to work with. Bennett nodded, didn't smile. This wasn't about enjoyment. This was about effectiveness, about ratings, about creating moments that would drive engagement, keep the daily dialogue trending in an increasingly crowded media landscape. Karoline Leavitt, he mused, the name itself carrying a certain Midwestern blandness that he found almost quaint. Young conservative spokesperson, rising star in right-wing circles, fresh-faced, earnest, predictable, or at least that's what the briefing notes said. Another voice in the endless parade of talking points and rehearsed outrage he had built a career on, exposing. He glanced at his watch. 20 minutes until they went live. The makeup artist approached, dabbed at his forehead as he continued reviewing the questions, the angles, the traps he had refined over years of confrontational interviews. 3 rows back in the audience, Claire Watson shifted in her seat, excitement mingling with anticipation as she whispered to her friend, "He always destroys these conservatives. I can't wait to see this one squirm." Around them, the audience buzzed, predominantly young, predominantly urban, predominantly aligned with Bennett's perspective. They hadn't come for dialogue, despite the show's optimistic title. They had come for demolition, for the reassuring spectacle of their worldview triumphant. Claire checked her phone. The show's social media accounts were already priming the audience. Today, Michael Bennett faces off with conservative spokesperson Karoline Leavitt on immigration, climate policy, and America's growing cultural divide. The implied promise was clear: another satisfying takedown, another clip to share, another reason to feel right. Backstage, in a small green room, Karoline Leavitt sat alone, reviewing her notes one final time. At 25, she was younger than most who entered Bennett's arena, but her expression carried a quiet certainty that belied her years. A production assistant had warned her in hushed, apologetic tones about Bennett's tactics, the interruptions, the traps, the carefully edited clips that would follow, designed to make her look foolish, unprepared, out of her depth. She had simply nodded, thanked him for the unnecessary warning. She had watched the daily dialogue before, understood exactly what she was walking into. Her phone buzzed with a message from her communications director. "Remember, stick to substance. Don't let him bait you into anger." She smiled slightly at the advice, slipped the phone into her jacket pocket. Anger had never been her style anyway. On the studio floor, camera operators positioned equipment, sound technicians adjusted levels. The floor director reviewed timing cues, all the invisible machinery that created the illusion of spontaneity, of authentic conversation, when in reality every moment was choreographed, calculated, controlled to create maximum impact. Bennett stood from his chair, approached the audience, his off-camera persona warmer, more personable than the incisive interrogator they would see once filming began. He thanked them for coming, reminded them about reaction shots, encouraged their participation, because the audience wasn't just observing, they were part of the performance. Their gasps, their laughter, their applause, all essential elements in the theater of modern political discourse. Back in the control room, Alicia surveyed the multiple monitors, each showing different angles, different perspectives of the carefully constructed reality they were about to broadcast to millions of viewers. "Ready the microphone levels," she instructed a technician. "Make sure we can control the mix." The subtle instruction was understood by everyone on the production team. They had done this before, knew exactly how to emphasize Bennett's voice while making his guests sound less authoritative, less confident, less credible. It wasn't cheating exactly, just production values. At least, that's what they told themselves. 5 minutes to air, the floor director announced. Bennett returned to his chair, reviewed his opening monologue, the jokes, the jabs, the framing that would set the tone for the confrontation to come. A makeup artist made final touches, a wardrobe assistant adjusted his lapel, the machinery of television humming around him, perfectly calibrated to create the illusion of effortless authority. Backstage, the production assistant approached Karoline with practiced professionalism. 2 minutes, Ms. Leavitt. She stood, smoothed her conservative blue blazer, checked her appearance one last time in the small mirror on the green room wall. Her expression revealed nothing of whatever nervousness she might feel facing one of media's most skilled and relentless interrogators. The assistant studied her curiously. They had seen many conservatives come through these doors, some combative, some nervous, some overconfident, all ultimately outmatched by Bennett's home court advantage. But something about this young woman felt different, unsettling almost. A calmness that seemed out of place given what was about to happen. 30 seconds, the floor director announced. The audience quieted, their anticipation almost tangible in the studio air. Cameras locked into position. Monitors displayed the opening graphics. The familiar theme music began, its driving rhythm building energy, creating momentum. Bennett straightened, adjusted his expression from relaxed to engaged. The transformation subtle but complete, from person to persona, from Michael to Bennett, the face of the daily dialogue, the voice millions trusted to confirm what they already believed about the world and everyone in it. Places, everyone, final seconds. Karoline waited at the edge of the set, out of camera range but ready, her breathing steady, her thoughts clear. She had prepared for this moment, not just with talking points and statistics, but with something Bennett might not expect, something his research team couldn't have found in her background, couldn't have prepared him to counter. The floor director's hand raised, then dropped in the universal signal. 3, 2, 1. And just like that. The daily dialogue was live. The machinery was in motion. The spectacle was beginning. But what no one in that studio realized, not Bennett, not the producers, not the audience eagerly awaiting another satisfying liberal victory, was that today's episode wouldn't follow the familiar script, wouldn't deliver the expected outcome, wouldn't reinforce the comfortable certainties they had all come to witness. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments happen when carefully constructed realities collide with unexpected truth. The cameras rolled, capturing every angle as Michael Bennett's practiced smile beamed into millions of homes. "Welcome to the Daily Dialogue," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "where we tackle the biggest issues facing our nation with honesty, with intelligence, with respect." The last word hung in the air, carrying a subtle irony lost on no one familiar with the show's format. The audience applauded on cue, cameras panning across their faces, capturing their enthusiasm, their anticipation, their certainty about what would follow. Bennett leaned forward slightly, signaling his opening monologue, the warm-up act before the main event. "Well, what a week it's been," he began, eyes sparkling with practiced wit. Politicians saying the quiet part out loud, climate deniers still confused about weather, and conservatives still trying to convince us that tax cuts for billionaires will somehow help the working class. The audience laughed right on cue, cameras capturing their nodding agreement, their shared understanding that they were the reasonable ones, the enlightened ones, the correct ones. Bennett continued for several minutes, each joke, each jab, each commentary building toward the introduction of today's guest. Backstage, Karoline listened, her expression revealing nothing, as Bennett's voice carried through the monitors, setting the stage for their encounter. She had expected this, of course. The framing, the positioning, the careful construction of reality before she even stepped on set. Alicia watched from the control room, nodding with satisfaction as Bennett hit each talking point perfectly, establishing the worldview their audience tuned in to have confirmed. "Today we're joined by Karoline Leavitt," Bennett finally announced, his tone shifting subtly from amused to skeptical. "She's the newest spokesperson for the Conservative Policy Alliance, and at just 25, one of the youngest defenders of policies many Americans find, let's say, concerning. The audience chuckled obligingly as cameras prepared to capture Karoline's entrance. The floor director motioned her forward, lights intensifying slightly, creating the subtle impression of an interrogation about to begin. Karoline walked onto the set, her steps measured, confident, not rushed, not hesitant. Her expression pleasant, professional, as Bennett stood to greet her. Cameras catching the moment when liberal authority met conservative youth. The handshake was brief, formal, Bennett's smile not quite reaching his eyes. Karoline's grip firm, but not aggressive. The silent assessment already beginning. "Please, have a seat." Bennett gestured toward the guest chair, positioned slightly lower than his own, another subtle production choice designed to create psychological advantage. The audience watched attentively as Karoline took her seat, arranged her papers, smoothed her blazer, her demeanor betraying no nervousness, no awareness of the trap being set. "Thank you for having me, Michael," she said, voice clear, steady. "It's always important to have conversations across political divides, especially in these polarized times." Bennett nodded, his expression suggesting he found her opening statement quaint, perhaps even naive. "Yes, let's talk about those divides," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "Particularly your organization's stance on immigration policy, which many find problematic at best and, at worst, well..." His expression finished the sentence, implying conclusions too obvious to require verbalization. The audience shifted forward slightly, recognizing the opening move in a familiar game they had seen Bennett play many times before. Karoline nodded, taking the question without defensiveness, without reaction to the implied criticism. "I think it's important to clarify what our actual policy positions are, rather than how they're often characterized," she began, her voice measured. "Our approach to immigration focuses on border security, yes, but also on streamlining legal immigration pathways, modernizing asylum processes, and addressing root causes in origin countries." Bennett's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't the defensive response he had anticipated, not the reactionary talking points his research team had prepared him for. Alicia frowned in the control room, tapping instructions to Bennett's earpiece. More pressure needed, a different angle. He nodded imperceptibly, then interrupted. "But your organization has supported policies that separated families at the border, that cut refugee admissions to historic lows, that characterized immigrants in ways many Americans found deeply troubling." The framing was perfect. The trap clearly laid, the audience tensed expectantly. Cameras zooming in, capturing what should have been a defensive moment, a flustered response, an emotional reaction. But Karoline simply paused briefly, then responded without raising her voice, without changing her composed demeanor. "I understand that perspective, and there are legitimate criticisms of certain past approaches," she acknowledged directly, "which is precisely why our current policy framework focuses on balance between security and compassion, between sovereignty and humanitarian obligation." She continued outlining specific proposals for immigration courts, asylum officers, visa processing improvements, her command of details unexpected, her tone neither apologetic nor combative, just informative, substantive, clear. Bennett felt the interview slipping, from confrontation to conversation, from gotcha moment to actual substance. Not what the audience had come for, not what the producers demanded, not what his reputation required. He shifted tactics, interrupting again. "That sounds reasonable on paper," he said with a dismissive wave, "but in practice your policies have resulted in real harm to real people. Don't those consequences matter more than your theoretical frameworks?" The audience murmured approval, recognizing the familiar pattern, the moral high ground, the appeal to emotion, the framing that made conservative positions seem cold, theoretical, detached, while liberal concerns were human, practical, real. Karoline met his gaze directly. "Of course, consequences matter," she said, "and that's precisely why we need to move beyond simplified narratives to address the complex realities at the border, where both security failures and humanitarian concerns coexist." She began citing specific examples from border communities, statistics on human trafficking, asylum backlogs, court case timelines, unaccompanied minors, her knowledge clearly exceeding what Bennett had been prepared to counter. Alicia's voice was urgent in his ear. "Cut her off! Different topic." He was losing control of the narrative. Bennett nodded imperceptibly, raised his hand, interrupting again. "Let's move on to climate policy," he said, not even acknowledging her previous points. "Your organization has consistently questioned the timeline and approach of green energy transitions, despite overwhelming scientific consensus that immediate action is needed." The pivot was abrupt, obvious to anyone watching closely, but he needed to regain control, needed to find territory where he could corner her more effectively. The audience shifted their attention, ready for the next round of what they expected to be a decisive liberal victory. But something was different now, a subtle change in the energy, as Karoline nodded, remaining composed despite the transparent tactic. "I'm happy to discuss climate policy," she said, her voice still calm, still measured, "though I was hoping to finish addressing your previous question first." Bennett waved dismissively. "I think viewers understand your position," he said with practiced authority. "Let's focus on the climate crisis, which your organization has repeatedly downplayed." The stage was set, the confrontation building, the trap laid once more with practiced precision. But Bennett couldn't know that this carefully constructed moment was about to take an unexpected turn. Bennett leaned forward aggressively now, his patience visibly thinning as Karoline maintained her composure despite his transparent tactics. "Your organization continues to push for fossil fuel expansion despite overwhelming evidence that it's literally destroying our planet." His tone had shifted, abandoning the veneer of journalistic neutrality for something more pointed, more personal. The audience responded immediately, murmurs of agreement, nods of approval, as Bennett finally took the gloves off. Karoline didn't flinch, didn't shift, her posture remaining open, professional. "That's actually a mischaracterization," she began. "I think it's important to clarify." Bennett cut her off with a dismissive wave. "We've all heard the talking points about jobs and energy independence, but at what cost?" The interruption was deliberate, calculated, designed to prevent her from establishing any substantive counter-narrative. In the control room, Alicia nodded approval. This was the Bennett they needed, assertive, dominant, controlling the exchange. On the panel screen next to Bennett, 3 commentators appeared, regular contributors to the daily dialogue, all nodding in synchronized agreement. "Can I just add something here?" the first panelist interjected, a climate journalist with a severe haircut and a practiced expression of concern. "The Conservative Policy Alliance has repeatedly undermined climate science, has repeatedly blocked meaningful legislation, has repeatedly prioritized corporate profits over our very survival." The audience applauded on cue, cameras capturing their righteous approval. Bennett gestured toward the monitors. "See, this is the fundamental disconnect between conservative rhetoric and reality. Your policies actively harm the planet while you hide behind economic arguments." Karoline waited calmly for the noise to subside, her expression neither defensive nor aggressive, just attentive, patient, focused. When there was finally a moment to respond, she began with the same measured tone. "If you'll allow me to address the actual policies rather than the characterizations, our approach focuses on technological innovation, market-driven solutions, and practical transition timelines that won't devastate working communities." Another panelist interrupted immediately, a professor with round glasses and a self-satisfied expression. "That's exactly the problem. These vague appeals to innovation while communities of color bear the brunt of environmental racism and climate damage. This isn't theoretical. These are real lives." The third panelist nodded vigorously, adding his own practiced indignation to the orchestrated pile-on. "And let's be honest, the Conservative Policy Alliance is funded by fossil fuel interests, so this concern for working communities rings rather hollow, wouldn't you say?" Around the studio, the audience responded with enthusiastic applause, clearly enjoying the spectacle of coordinated attack. Bennett sat back slightly, satisfied. This was the rhythm he knew well, the dynamic that had made his show a liberal institution, a safe space where conservative ideas were not just challenged, but demolished, systematically, conclusively. Karoline waited once again, her patience almost unsettling in the face of such coordinated hostility. "Actually," she said when given the briefest opening, "our funding is publicly disclosed and comes primarily from individual donors, not corporate interests. But more importantly, I'd like to address the concrete policy differences." Bennett interrupted again, more forcefully this time. "Look, We can debate funding sources all day, but the reality is your policies deny climate science, ignore experts, and will lead to catastrophic outcomes. His tone now openly contemptuous, the pretense of dialogue completely abandoned. Alicia's voice came through his earpiece. Perfect. Keep pushing. She's bound to crack. The audience was fully engaged now, leaning forward expectantly, waiting for the moment Karoline would falter, would show anger, frustration, defensiveness, would provide the emotional reaction that would become the viral clip, the shareable moment, the confirmation of everything they believed about conservatives. Young, female, unable to handle pressure. The floor director signaled for camera 3 to zoom in on Karoline's face, capturing every micro-expression, every hint of distress or agitation. But her features remained composed, her breathing steady, her focus unwavering. "I understand your perspective," she began again, "but if we're truly concerned about climate outcomes rather than political positioning, we should examine which approaches actually work." She began citing specific examples of failed climate initiatives alongside successful ones: technological breakthroughs, market adaptations, practical implementation challenges. Her knowledge detailed, specific, nuanced in a way that didn't fit the narrative Bennett had constructed so carefully. The second panelist interjected again. "These are just delay tactics, more conservative obstruction while the planet literally burns." His voice rose with performative outrage, and the audience immediately mirrored him with murmurs of agreement. Bennett seized the moment. "This is exactly the problem, isn't it?" he said, turning directly to the camera. "Young conservatives like Ms. Leavitt here, repeating the same tired talking points while offering no real solutions to the existential crises we face." The framing was perfect, dismissing her age, her perspective, her knowledge in one carefully constructed statement. Karoline finally shifted her approach, recognizing the pattern that was unfolding. "I notice," she said, her voice still calm but firmer now, "that when I offer specific policy details or try to correct mischaracterizations, I'm interrupted with generalizations. Do viewers deserve a more substantive discussion than this?" The statement hung in the air, a direct challenge to the show's format itself, to Bennett's entire approach, to the choreographed spectacle masquerading as dialogue. The control room erupted in urgent whispers, Alicia's voice sharp in Bennett's ear. "Shut this down now. Don't let her reframe the conversation." Bennett's expression hardened, his smile tightening into something that no longer pretended to be friendly. "That's a convenient deflection," he said. "But let's talk about your organization's position on renewable energy subsidies, which your website explicitly opposes." The pivot was obvious, desperate almost, an attempt to regain control of a conversation that was slipping from his carefully structured format. Karoline nodded, acknowledging the question, but before she could answer, the first panelist jumped in again. "It's actually worse than that. Their policy brief specifically calls renewable energy mandates government overreach, while conveniently ignoring the massive subsidies fossil fuels receive." The third panelist quickly added, "And let's not forget their opposition to the Green New Deal, which would have created millions of good-paying jobs while addressing climate justice." Bennett nodded along, satisfied, as the panelists performed their roles perfectly, creating the impression of overwhelming consensus against a single, isolated conservative voice. The audience responded on cue, with approving nods, concerned expressions, occasional bursts of affirmative applause. "Exactly," Bennett said, turning back to Karoline. "How do you justify these contradictions, these obvious double standards, these policies that demonstrate clear disregard for our planet's future?" The question wasn't really a question, but a statement designed to corner, to trap, to force either defensive reaction or embarrassed concession, neither of which would serve Karoline well. But as she began to respond, to lay out the specific policy differences between market incentives and mandates, between effective and ineffective approaches, Bennett interrupted one final time, his patience completely exhausted. "We need to move on," he said with dismissive finality. "We have many topics to cover, and listeners have heard enough about your climate positions." The silencing was deliberate, obvious, the message clear to everyone watching. Her voice, her perspective, her knowledge were simply not welcome, not worthy of airtime or consideration on the daily dialogue. The floor director signaled for cameras to focus on Bennett, as he prepared to transition to the next topic, the next opportunity for confrontation, the next chance to create the viral moment they all craved. But something unexpected happened, something that wasn't in the script, something that would transform not just this interview, but the entire conversation that followed. Before Bennett could move to his next topic, before the cameras could shift away, before the moment could be lost forever, Karoline Leavitt did something unexpected, something the production team, the audience, and Bennett himself were completely unprepared for. She spoke anyway, her voice clear, steady, unflinching. "Actually, Michael, I'd like to finish my thought." 5 simple words, delivered without anger or defensiveness. Just quiet determination that somehow cut through the carefully constructed architecture of the entire show. The audience stilled, suddenly uncertain how to respond to this deviation from the script. The control room froze momentarily, even Alicia caught off guard by the calm assertion that defied their entire production strategy. Bennett blinked, his rhythm broken, his practiced control momentarily shaken by the simple request that somehow carried more authority than his dismissal. "I think we've covered that topic sufficiently," he attempted, his voice carrying the same dismissive certainty as before. But something had shifted in the room, some invisible transfer of power that everyone felt but couldn't quite name. Karoline smiled, not with aggression, not with challenge, but with something that looked almost like compassion. "You know what I find interesting," she said, her voice both soft and clear, carrying to every corner of the studio. "For the past 15 minutes, I've been told what I believe, what my organization stands for, what my motives are, without being allowed to actually speak about any of those things." The statement hung in the air, simple, direct, undeniable. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some looking down, some looking away, suddenly aware of their participation in exactly what she had described. Bennett attempted to regain control. "That's hardly fair. We've given you plenty of opportunity." But Karoline continued as if he hadn't spoken at all. "I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire," she said, her voice taking on a quality that demanded attention, not through volume, but through authenticity. "My father lost his construction business during the 2008 recession. We lost our home. My parents worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table for me and my siblings." The personal story, unexpected, authentic, caught everyone off guard. This wasn't in her file, wasn't in the briefing notes, wasn't part of the predictable conservative talking points they had prepared to counter. Bennett glanced toward the control room, seeking direction, guidance, intervention. But Alicia was watching the audience, watching their faces transform from dismissive enjoyment of confrontation to something else entirely, genuine attention. "I saw firsthand," Karoline continued, "what happens when policies made in distant cities by well-intentioned people with good educations crash into the lives of working families who don't have financial cushions, who can't wait for theoretical long-term benefits while facing immediate hardship." The studio had gone completely silent, cameras now focused entirely on her, capturing something the producers suddenly realized was more compelling than the confrontation they had planned. "When I was 19, she continued, "I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college while watching classmates with advanced degrees propose economic and environmental policies that would devastate the communities I came from. Not out of malice, but out of distance, out of disconnect from the consequences." The panelists exchanged uncomfortable glances, their prepared talking points suddenly feeling hollow, performative in the face of lived experience authentically shared. "So yes, I believe in climate science," she said, directly addressing their earlier attacks. "I believe in environmental protection. I believe in creating sustainable futures. But I also believe that how we get there matters, that the paths we choose have real consequences for real people who don't have the luxury of weathering economic transitions easily." Bennett attempted to interrupt again, to redirect, to regain control, but his voice somehow lacked the authority it had carried earlier. Karoline wasn't shouting, wasn't emotional, wasn't displaying any of the behaviors that would have justified cutting her off, that would have made her seem unreasonable. She was simply speaking truth from a place of authentic experience. "When you dismissed my concerns about policy approaches," she continued, looking directly at Bennett now, "you weren't just dismissing me. You were dismissing the voices of millions who share those same concerns, who worry about how they'll heat their homes, fill their gas tanks, feed their families while we transition to new energy systems. The audience was completely still now, some nodding slightly in recognition, some with expressions suggesting they were hearing something familiar, but from an unexpected source. In the control room, Alicia watched the real-time social media response exploding across platforms, not with the outrage they had anticipated, but with something far more powerful, genuine engagement across political lines. "Let her talk. Keep the cameras on her," she instructed urgently, recognizing that something rare, something valuable, something real was happening before their eyes. Bennett sat back slightly, his posture shifting from aggressive inquisitor to reluctant listener as Karoline continued. "I joined the Conservative Policy Alliance not to block progress, but to ensure that progress includes everyone, that it accounts for real costs, that it acknowledges trade-offs honestly, that it respects the lives and livelihoods of people who don't have platforms like this one." Her voice remained steady, neither rising in defensiveness nor falling in apology, just clear, authentic, certain. "The story I'm trying to tell," she said, "is that we can achieve the same goals, clean air, clean water, sustainable futures, while disagreeing honestly about methods, about timelines, about implementation, about how to balance immediate needs with long-term objectives." The cameras captured something transforming in the studio atmosphere itself, as performative conflict gave way to genuine communication. The panelists sat silent, their rehearsed outrage suddenly seeming shallow, inappropriate in the face of the authentic exchange now unfolding. "What I've experienced on this show today," she continued with the same measured tone, "is exactly what millions of Americans experience in our broader political conversation. Assumptions about their motives, dismissal of their concerns, silencing of their voices because they don't fit a predetermined narrative." Bennett realized too late that the viral moment was indeed happening, but not the one he had planned, not the one that would reinforce his reputation, his brand, his approach, but something that challenged all three, that revealed the emptiness of the entire performance masquerading as dialogue. And as Karoline Leavitt continued speaking, her voice clear, her experience authentic, her perspective unfiltered by interruption, something shifted, not just in the studio, but in the thousands of homes where viewers watched, transfixed by something they rarely encountered on shows like The Daily Dialogue. Honest, authentic exchange across political divides. The studio felt different now, transformed by something authentic that had broken through the carefully constructed performance of political discourse. Bennett sat unnaturally still, his usual confidence visibly shaken as Karoline continued speaking, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with quiet clarity that somehow carried more authority than his practiced persona. "I believe we can protect our environment," she said, "while also protecting livelihoods. I believe we can secure our borders while maintaining our humanitarian values. I believe we can acknowledge problems without demonizing those who see different solutions than we do." The audience watched, transfixed, their expressions shifting from the smugness of an anticipated takedown to something more complex, more thoughtful, more engaged. Cameras moved between their faces, capturing the transformation in real time as performance gave way to participation in something unexpectedly meaningful. In the control room, Alicia stared at the social media feeds exploding across multiple monitors, the hashtag #LetHerSpeak. Trending as clips from moments earlier, spread with unprecedented speed, comments flooding in from unexpected sources, from people who never engaged with the show, from across political spectrums. "This is what political discourse should be," someone had written, their comment already gaining thousands of likes. "Why don't we ever get to hear these perspectives without the shouting, without the interruptions?" Bennett glanced toward the monitors, saw what was happening, realized the show had slipped completely beyond his control, beyond the familiar format, beyond the safe, predictable confrontation that had built his reputation, his career. Karoline seemed to sense the shift, not with triumph, not with vindication, but with quiet acknowledgement of the opportunity suddenly present to have the conversation that mattered, the one beneath the performance. "When we reduce complex policies to simplistic moral labels," she continued, "we lose the chance to find actual solutions, to build meaningful consensus, to address the real challenges facing Americans who don't have the luxury of ideological purity, who need practical, workable approaches." The first panelist opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, recognizing that his prepared talking points, his rehearsed outrage, would now seem exactly what they were: performance, not substance. The second panelist looked down at his notes, suddenly uncomfortable with the role he had played in the attempted silencing of a voice that deserved to be heard. The studio audience shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with genuine interest, others looking slightly ashamed at their earlier participation in what now seemed a shallow exercise in the confirmation bias. "I didn't come here expecting fair treatment," Karoline acknowledged with surprising candor. "I've watched this show. I understand its format. I know the role I was meant to play in today's entertainment." The directness of her statement left no room for denial, no space for pretense that what happened on the daily dialogue was anything other than what she described. Bennett attempted to regain footing. "That's hardly fair," he started. "This show has always provided a platform." But his words sounded hollow even to himself, lacked the conviction that usually carried them to approving audiences and nodding guests. Karoline smiled, not unkindly. "There's that word again. Fair," she noted. "And maybe that's really what we should be talking about. What fairness actually looks like in our political discourse, in our policy debates, in our shared national conversation." The camera operators exchanged glances, recognizing they were capturing something rare, valuable, authentic. The controlled confrontation had given way to genuine exchange, to real dialogue, to something that actually mattered. The floor director stared at her clipboard, the remaining segments carefully planned with gotcha questions, with traps, with setups, all designed to create viral moments of conservative discomfort, all now completely unusable in the new reality unfolding before them. "What if," Karoline continued, "we actually listened to each other? What if we acknowledged the legitimate concerns on both sides of policy debates? What if we recognized that most Americans, regardless of political affiliation, want similar outcomes, even when they disagree on methods?" Bennett shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't confrontation, wasn't conflict, wasn't the content that drove ratings, that generated clicks, that built careers. This was something else entirely, something that challenged not just his show, but the entire media ecosystem built on division, on opposition, on performance. One of the camera operators had tears in her eyes, a reaction she quickly tried to hide, embarrassed by her emotional response to words that somehow cut through years of professional cynicism, to touch something long forgotten about why journalism mattered. The third panelist finally spoke, but not with the rehearsed outrage that had characterized earlier contributions. "You mentioned your background," he said, his tone genuinely curious. "How did that shape your specific views on environmental policy implementation?" The question wasn't a trap, wasn't an attack, was simply an inquiry, an opening to actual dialogue, to real understanding. Karoline nodded appreciatively. "When you grow up watching your parents struggle to afford heating oil in New Hampshire winters," she explained, "you develop a different perspective on energy transition timelines, on the real costs of policy decisions, on the importance of practical stepwise approaches that don't leave working families behind." Bennett watched as his show transformed before his eyes, as the audience engaged, not as partisan observers of political combat, but as citizens genuinely interested in understanding complex issues from multiple perspectives. Alicia's voice came through his earpiece, not with directives for confrontation, but with simple production guidance. "Let this happen. The social media response is unprecedented. Viewers are actually increasing mid-broadcast. We're reaching demographics we never touch." She sounded almost in awe at the metrics unfolding across her screens, at the engagement surging beyond anything they had seen in the show's history. The second panelist leaned forward, building on his colleague's question, asking about specific policy alternatives, about practical implementation approaches, about the nuances deliberately obscured by the usual political performance. And Karoline responded, with detailed knowledge, with practical examples, with candid acknowledgement of trade-offs, of challenges, of legitimate concerns that existed on both sides of complex issues. The audience was completely transformed now, their expressions thoughtful, engaged, respectful, as performance gave way to participation in something that actually mattered. Bennett felt something shift within himself, a reluctant recognition that what was happening, while threatening everything he had built, was also revealing possibilities he had long ago abandoned for what political discourse could be, for what media could contribute, for what conversation could accomplish when it transcended performance, when it embraced authenticity, when it prioritized understanding over division. And as the segment continued unfolding in ways no one had anticipated, cameras captured not just the conversation, but the transformation itself. The moment when political theater gave way to genuine exchange, when pre-formulated talking points surrendered to authentic dialogue, when the daily dialogue finally lived up to the name it had only pretended to deserve. Beyond the studio walls, beyond the lights, cameras, and microphones, something extraordinary was happening across digital landscapes and living rooms as screens lit up with an unexpected revelation. The moment Karoline refused to be silenced, when an authentic voice broke through performance, had escaped the confines of the daily dialogue and spiraled outward with unprecedented speed. Megan Taylor, the network's social media director, stared at her monitors, watching metrics explode beyond anything she had seen in 15 years of digital media. "This isn't normal," she whispered to her assistant, who nodded wide-eyed at the engagement, the shares, the comments flowing faster than their systems could track. "Watch what happens when this conservative actually gets to speak," posted at Media Truth, attaching a 40-second clip that had already reached 2 million views in 17 minutes. "I don't agree with her politics, but I respect the hell out of this response," wrote a liberal commentator, his share generating its own cascade of cross-ideological conversation. In living rooms across America, viewers who had tuned in expecting the familiar comfort of reinforced beliefs and the satisfaction of conservative humiliation found themselves instead leaning forward, phones in hand, recording, sharing, responding to something that transcended the usual divisions. 34-year-old Samantha Ellis, a devoted daily dialogue viewer since college, texted the clip to her conservative father, with whom she hadn't discussed politics since the 2016 election. "Maybe we could talk about this," her message read, tentative, hopeful, a small bridge extended across a divide that had seemed uncrossable. In the network's executive offices, emergency meetings convened as senior leadership struggled to process what was unfolding on their flagship show, on screens around the country and the world. "It's off format, completely off format," the programming director insisted. "But it's generating unprecedented engagement," the digital director countered, showing statistics that defied all their previous assumptions about what audiences wanted, what drove viewership, what created connection. In college dorms, office break rooms, airports, and restaurants, wherever screens displayed the daily dialogue. Unusual crowds gathered, watching, not with the partisan division that normally characterized political content consumption, but with shared attention, shared interest, shared recognition that something authentic was breaking through the familiar performance. Conservative media, which had originally planned outraged responses to Bennett's expected takedown, scrambled to adjust their coverage as the narrative slipped beyond the familiar patterns of partisan combat. "This is what happens when our voices actually get heard," wrote one outlet, sharing the full unedited exchange rather than edited clips designed to outrage. Liberal publications, normally aligned with Bennett's perspective, found themselves in unfamiliar territory, acknowledging the power of Karoline's authentic voice, the legitimacy of concerns normally dismissed, the possibility that different viewpoints deserved actual consideration. "A lesson in listening," read an unexpected headline from a progressive news site, as the boundaries between media ecosystems, normally strictly enforced, suddenly blurred in an unprecedented moment of shared attention. Todd Wilson, Bennett's longtime producer who was off today, watched from home, his phone exploding with messages, questions, observations about what they were all witnessing. For 15 years, they had perfected the formula: confrontation, conflict, confirmation, giving audiences exactly what they thought they wanted: reinforcement of existing beliefs, validation of partisan perspectives, the emotional satisfaction of opposition demolished. And in one unplanned, authentic moment, Karoline Leavitt had revealed the emptiness, the shallowness, the ultimate futility of that entire approach. In network headquarters, executives watched the real-time ratings with stunned disbelief as viewership climbed dramatically mid-broadcast, reaching demographics they never attracted, holding attention they never sustained, generating response they never inspired. Social media moderators struggled to keep pace with comment sections, normally toxic wastelands of partisan sniping, now suddenly filled with thoughtful engagement, with questions, with reflections, with something approaching actual dialogue. A psychology professor in Boston recorded the segment for her students as an illustration of authentic communication, breaking through performative conflict to create unexpected connection across seemingly unbridgeable divides. 3 major network competitors immediately scheduled editorial meetings to discuss implications for their own formats, their own approaches, their own assumptions about political coverage, about audience desires, about what media could and should provide in an age of division and performance. Karoline's social media accounts gained hundreds of thousands of followers within an hour. Her mentions filled not just with conservative praise, but with messages from across the political spectrum, acknowledging the power of her approach, the value of her perspective, the impact of her voice when not filtered through partisan framing. Back in the Daily Dialogue control room, Alicia watched the final minutes of broadcast with something between awe and anxiety, as everything they had built, everything they knew, everything they assumed about their audience was suddenly called into question by the unexpected power of authenticity over performance, of connection over conflict, of dialogue over demolition. Bennett's earpiece remained silent now. No producer instructions, no strategic guidance, just the unprecedented experience of actually listening to a perspective he had invited only to dismiss, of engaging with ideas he had planned only to attack, of participating in actual dialogue that transcended the hollow performance that had built his career, his reputation, his brand. Network phones rang constantly now, interview requests pouring in for Karoline, not just from conservative outlets, but from across the media landscape. Producers, directors, hosts all sensing something important had happened, something that required follow-up, something that might even require change in their own approaches, assumptions, and formats. The segment, designed to create viral moments of conservative discomfort, had indeed gone viral, but for reasons no one had anticipated, no one had planned, no one had believed possible. In the artificial landscape of political media, a 25-year-old conservative spokesperson with an authentic voice and lived experience had broken through the carefully constructed architecture of performative discourse to remind everyone watching, everyone sharing, everyone responding what real conversation, what genuine exchange, what actual dialogue could look like, stripped of performance, infused with authenticity, grounded in respect. And as the broadcast finally ended, as cameras stopped rolling, as microphones went dead, as the studio audience filed out in thoughtful silence rather than satisfied enthusiasm, the digital cascade continued to build, to spread, to transform. Not just one segment, not just one show, not just one network, but the very nature of political discourse itself, at least for this one extraordinary moment when authenticity broke through, and everyone watching, everyone responding, everyone sharing, suddenly remembered what they had been missing all along. 3 days after the broadcast, the ripples had become waves, crashing against established shores and reshaping the media landscape in ways no one had predicted. Karoline Leavitt sat in her apartment, watching as the conversation continued beyond her control, beyond anyone's, taking on a life of its own. The Daily Dialogue's executive team had called an emergency weekend meeting, their entire format suddenly questioned not just by viewers or critics, but by their own staff and producers, who had witnessed what happened when performance gave way to authenticity, when demolition yielded to dialogue. The clip had been viewed 70 million times across platforms, reaching audiences who normally ignored anything labeled as political discourse. Media analysts wrote lengthy pieces about the hunger for authentic exchange revealed in those unscripted minutes when a young woman refused to be silenced, refused to play her expected role in political theater. Bennett himself had gone uncharacteristically silent, his usual social media presence suspended, as he processed what it all meant for his show, his brand, and his approach to political discourse. Harvard's Shorenstein Center announced a special symposium examining the implications for political communication, while the Conservative Policy Alliance saw internship applications triple, not just from predictable demographics, but from young people across the spectrum, drawn to the idea of substantive engagement beyond partisanship. Karoline's phone rang again, with another interview request, this time from a prestigious Sunday show, not to discuss conservative talking points, but to explore what had happened in that studio, the moment authenticity broke through performance, and what it might mean for American discourse. She accepted, recognizing the responsibility that came with the attention and the opportunity to build on what had started. 3 major networks had already announced format changes, moving away from predictable partisan panels and orchestrated conflict towards something that prioritized substance and respected audience intelligence. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Jessica Winters, a producer at a rival network, argued in an extended staff meeting that viewers still wanted confirmation, still wanted combat, still wanted their side to win. But the data suggested otherwise, showing migration toward programming that offered depth and respected multiple perspectives. Political science professors added the segment to their course materials as an example of authenticity breaking through the usual partisan boundaries, while communication scholars analyzed the moment when silencing failed, when control was lost, and when authenticity prevailed to create unexpected connection. The Daily Dialogue's ratings didn't drop as some had predicted. Instead, they transformed, attracting viewers who had previously avoided political programming, uninterested in the performative combat that had long defined the genre. Network executives revised their assumptions about what audiences truly desired, as journalism schools scheduled panels to discuss what some were already calling the Leavitt moment, when the artificial constraints of political discourse were temporarily transcended. Young journalists, particularly women, reached out to Karoline with messages of gratitude, seeing in her a path beyond performance, proof that substance could matter more than conformity to expected roles. Conservative media, which initially celebrated the moment as a victory over liberal bias, soon shifted toward deeper analysis of what had actually happened when performance receded and authentic exchange took its place. Progressive outlets, traditionally aligned with Bennett's confrontational style, found themselves questioning their assumptions about audience desires and the responsibility of media in fostering meaningful discourse. Digital analysts found patterns in the broadcast's engagement metrics that defied conventional wisdom about what drove connection, suggesting a hunger for something beyond the hollow satisfaction of having one's beliefs merely confirmed. 3 competing networks invited Karoline for interviews, not as a conservative counterpoint to liberal narratives, but for something more substantive, more reflective of what audiences had responded to. Meanwhile, Michael Bennett's agent fielded calls from executives wondering if he was willing to evolve, to adapt, to shift from confrontation to conversation, from performance to authenticity. The Aspen Institute announced a special session at its upcoming festival to examine the implications for democratic discourse, civic engagement, and political communication in an age of polarization. Viewers like Lisa Chambers, who had watched the segment with her college-age daughter, found themselves discussing policies beyond partisan framing for the first time in years. University departments reported increased interest in courses on political discourse, media ethics, and the relationship between performance and authenticity in contemporary journalism. The segment was translated into 12 languages, carrying its impact beyond American politics into global discussions about authentic dialogue. Media watchdogs noted subtle shifts across political programming: more substance, fewer interruptions, more complexity, less caricature, as networks scrambled to capture the audience's hunger for something real. Alicia, Bennett's longtime producer, spent hours rewatching past segments with a new perspective, suddenly seeing the patterns of manipulation and dismissal that had once seemed like just the nature of the format. Young conservative women gained new platforms as outlets recognized the demand for voices too often filtered through hostile framing. The Conservative Policy Alliance received partnership inquiries from across the political spectrum, inspired by Karoline's substantive approach. And Karoline herself understood the weight of this moment, the opportunity to demonstrate what political discourse could be beyond performance, what a conservative voice could sound like beyond caricature, what a young woman's contribution could mean beyond dismissal. As the conversation continued evolving, as the moment reverberated through media, politics, and personal relationships once strained by performative division, something deeper shifted. Not just in format or approach, but in the fundamental assumptions about what was possible in communication across seemingly unbridgeable divides. 1 month after the broadcast that changed everything, Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium of Georgetown University's Kennedy Institute, addressing a packed auditorium of students, journalists, and policymakers gathered to discuss the future of political discourse in America. "I didn't walk into that studio planning to create a moment," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying the same authenticity that had broken through the carefully constructed performance of The Daily Dialogue. "I simply refused to play the role I was expected to play." The audience listened attentively, not with partisan division, not with ideological sorting, but with shared curiosity about what happened when performance gave way to authenticity, when conflict yielded to conversation, when demolition transformed into dialogue. Across the media landscape, profound shifts had taken place. The Daily Dialogue itself had undergone the most visible transformation, its format completely reimagined to prioritize substance over spectacle, understanding over opposition, genuine exchange over manufactured conflict. Michael Bennett had taken 3 weeks off, returning with a public statement acknowledging the limitations, the emptiness, and the ultimate futility of the approach that had built his career. "I've been asking myself," he wrote, "whether I've been contributing to understanding or merely to division, whether I've been illuminating issues or merely exploiting them for ratings, for relevance, for reassurance." His honesty, unexpected and uncharacteristic, had itself gone viral, generating responses from colleagues, competitors, and critics, all recognizing something important in his willingness to reconsider, to evolve, to acknowledge the limitations of approaches previously unquestioned. The network's ratings had transformed, not diminished as some had predicted, but shifted dramatically in composition, drawing viewers who had previously avoided political programming entirely, finding nothing of value in partisan combat, nothing of substance in performative conflict. Media competitors had followed suit, revising formats, approaches, and assumptions about what audiences wanted, what engagement meant, and what responsibility they bore to democratic discourse beyond simple confirmation of existing beliefs. Karoline continued her address, sharing observations about what happened when an authentic voice broke through the artificial constraints of political performance. "I believe Americans are hungry for substance, for sincerity, for respect," she said, "for conversations that acknowledge the complexity of issues beyond partisan framing, for voices that speak from lived experience rather than rehearsed talking points, for exchanges that seek understanding rather than merely victory." The audience nodded, some taking notes, some recording, some simply absorbing the possibility of political discourse beyond the familiar patterns of division. Georgetown's Institute had created a new fellowship program, examining the relationship between authenticity and engagement, between substance and audience response, between format, and the democratic function of media in the contemporary landscape. Applications had flooded in from students across the political spectrum, seeking to contribute to the evolution of political communication beyond performance, beyond polarization, beyond the artificial constraints that had limited discourse for so long. The Conservative Policy Alliance had expanded, creating dialogue initiatives and partnerships with organizations across the political spectrum, focused on specific policy areas where different perspectives could contribute to more robust, more effective, and more inclusive solutions. "What I've learned," Karoline reflected, "is that Americans aren't as divided as our political media has portrayed. Our disagreements are real, our perspectives differ, our priorities sometimes conflict. But beneath these differences lies a shared concern for our communities, for our country, for our future that transcends partisan framing." Michael Bennett now appeared weekly in a completely reimagined format, featuring extended conversations with diverse perspectives, focused not on generating conflict, but on understanding, not on confirming bias, but on exploring complexity, not on demolishing opposition, but on discovering areas of potential consensus beyond partisan division. His ratings initially dropped, then climbed, attracting viewers who found value in substance, in authenticity, in respect, elements that had been absent from the previous format. Nielsen data revealed surprising patterns as political programming across networks shifted toward substance, toward authenticity, toward genuine exchange, attracting audiences previously disengaged from political media, finding nothing of value in the partisan performance. Academic research confirmed what viewership suggested, that hunger for authentic discourse, for meaningful exchange, for respectful engagement with complex issues transcended partisan division, and was shared by Americans across the political spectrum who had simply abandoned media landscapes that offered only confirmation or combat. 3 major universities had created research initiatives examining the implications for democratic discourse, for civic engagement, for political communication beyond polarization, beyond the artificial constraints of format that had limited exchange for so long. What if we created media environments, Karoline suggested, that rewarded substance, that prioritized understanding, that valued authentic voice over rehearsed performance, that acknowledged the complexity of issues beyond simplistic partisan framing, that actually contributed to democratic function rather than merely exploiting division? When she stood in that studio, she reflected, refusing to be silenced, refusing to perform the expected role in political theater, she wasn't thinking about changing the media landscape. She was simply insisting on being heard, on speaking truth from lived experience, on bringing authenticity to a conversation that had been entirely performative. The moment had inspired young conservatives, particularly women, to claim their voice, to demand a hearing, to break through the dismissive framing, the silencing tactics, the performative contexts designed to diminish rather than illuminate perspectives. But more significantly, it had inspired media executives, producers, and hosts to reconsider fundamental assumptions about political communication, about audience desires, about their own responsibility to democratic discourse, beyond ratings, beyond relevance, beyond reassurance. We have an opportunity now, Karoline concluded, to transform how we talk to each other, how we listen to each other, how we understand complex issues, beyond partisan frameworks, beyond political theater, beyond the artificial constraints that have limited genuine exchange for far too long. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not with partisan enthusiasm, not with ideological sorting, but with shared recognition of possibility. When authenticity breaks through performance, when substance replaces spectacle, when understanding outweighs opposition, her words resonated beyond the auditorium walls, beyond Georgetown, beyond Washington, to living rooms and classrooms and boardrooms, where Americans had witnessed the possibility of political discourse that actually illuminated rather than merely inflamed, that actually contributed to understanding rather than merely confirming the comfortable certainties of partisan perspective. Michael Bennett watched the live stream from his office, considering the implications for his own evolution, his own contribution to the political landscape, beyond performance, beyond the hollow satisfaction of demolition, towards something more meaningful, more valuable, more aligned with democratic function. Karoline's social media filled with messages from across the political spectrum, acknowledging the impact of that moment, the possibility it revealed, the hunger it exposed for something beyond partisan combat, for something authentic, substantial, respectful in political discourse across divides. Across America, similar conversations unfolded as performance yielded, however briefly, to possibility, as confirmation gave way to curiosity, as combat surrendered to conversation, revealing a hunger for authentic exchange that transcended partisan division, that offered hope for democratic discourse beyond polarization. If this story moved you, if it made you reconsider how we talk, how we listen, how we understand across political divides, across ideological difference, across the artificial barriers we've constructed, share it. Because sometimes transformation begins not with grand declarations, not with policy changes, not with institutional reform, but with a simple insistence on authenticity, on being heard, on speaking truth from lived experience beyond performance. Subscribe for more stories that illuminate possibilities. When we dare to break through the artificial constraints of political discourse, when we insist on authenticity, when we prioritize understanding over victory, when we finally start listening to voices beyond our comfortable certainties, to perspectives that challenge our assumptions, to truths that transcend partisan framing, to possibilities for connection beyond the divisions we've accepted as inevitable, as permanent, as unbridgeable, when in reality they may be more artificial, more surmountable, more destructible than we ever imagined.